Welcome back to the Ohio Farm Bureau podcast. I'm Ty Higgins, previewing our Young Ag Professionals Winter Leadership Experience happening in Columbus, January 26th and 27th, a chance for Ohio Farm Bureau members ages 18 to 35 to connect, network with friends, relax, and recharge. Brooks Lamb is our guest this week on our podcast, one of our featured speakers at our Winter Leadership Experience. Brooks, they still let me into this conference, even though I aged out just a few years ago.
Gotcha. Well, we're going to be happy to have you there, Todd.
Hey, a lot to talk about here. You're with American Farmland Trust, for those who don't know who Brooks Lamb is. So tell us about yourself and what you do there with your organization.
Yeah, well, first off, thanks for having me, Todd. I really appreciate it. I've been looking forward to our conversation for a while now. So I'm the land protection and access specialist with American Farmland Trust. American Farmland Trust is a national conservation organization, been around for over 40 years. And we've kind of got what I like to call a three-legged stool approach to our mission. If you take any one of those three legs away, the whole stool is just going to topple right over. So the first part of our mission really focuses on farmland protection from things like suburban sprawl and haphazard real estate development. The second focus of our mission looks at sound farming practices and how we can promote sound farming practices that are good for the land, good for watersheds, good for the environment, but also good for the farmer. Finally, the third leg of our mission is what we often call keeping farmers on the land. And that really directly translates to enhancing economic viability for farmers and farm communities, trying to help usher the next generation of farmers onto the land as well. So I feel really lucky to get to work on all of these different topics. I also write on these topics. So aside from my work at American Farmland Trust, I'm also the author of Love for the Land, Lessons from Farmers Who Persist in Place. So a book that looks at some of the challenges that especially small and mid-sized farmers face, but also looks at why they're continuing to care for the land in the face of that adversity. So some really inspiring stories that folks can check out there. And beyond the professional work, the writing work, these topics are really important to me personally. So I grew up on a small family farm in rural Tennessee, about 40 to 50 miles south of Nashville. My family is still on that land. I am who I am largely because of that farm and the people who have cared for it over several generations. So really, really thankful to get to work on these issues because it feels like both a personal and a professional calling for me.
In Ohio, we're in a really unique situation when it comes to farmland. We talk often about how we have these larger cities and these mid-major, I'll call them, cities. So we have Columbus, Cleveland, Cincy, obviously, but then we look at Toledo and Akron and Youngstown and Dayton. And being that we have farmers that are close to those metropolitan areas is a very good thing. But at the same time, it could be a little bit counterintuitive in the fact that you talked about urban sprawl. We're seeing that pretty much everywhere in Ohio right now.
Yeah, no, for sure. And just to throw another city out there to boost my Ohio street cred a little bit, spent some time up in Bowling Green for the tractor pulls there. So, I can, people in Ohio can, I know what I'm seeing here, I know the places we're talking about. You're right. Being close to these major urban areas or the mid-sized urban areas can really be an advantage for a lot of farmers and farm families because there is a local foods market. There are folks who are really interested in tapping into these local food systems, and farmers are really the foundation of that. But you're also right that there are some real challenges associated with farming close to these really booming population centers. So American Farmland Trust data tries to project forward to see how farmland loss is going to affect communities across the country between 2016 and 2040. So kind of a 25 year range there. We do that nationally, and we also do it state by state, and we do it county by county. And the data for Ohio is it's pretty concerning. Ohio is a state where agriculture is really, really important. It's important part of the economy, important part of the culture. Yet our data suggests that Ohio is projected to convert or compromise over 500,000 acres of farmland over the next 20 or so years. There's a situation where that farmland loss could be even more aggressive. So it's something we really need to be thinking about, because the land itself is the foundation of our agricultural systems. And so we really need to be thinking about how we can protect that land, how we can help get more new and beginning and young farmers on that land, and really just continue to be good stewards of what is truly an irreplaceable resource.
What does that conversation look like? You're going to have hundreds, if not thousands, of young people here at the Winter Leadership Experience at the end of January in Columbus. And the last thing you want to do is burst their bubble, because you do need farmland in order to farm. There's no doubt about that. So how does that conversation go to make them aware of this very important issue, but also keep them interested in being a part of agriculture for their career?
Yeah, no doubt. I think the conversation starts by being honest, and by reckoning with some of this data and these findings that American Farmland Trust and other organizations are putting out. But we can't stop at just acknowledging the challenges, right? There's no hope in just saying, here's these huge challenges, and then not saying anything else. There are things we can do to address that farmland loss, and to actually use things like farmland protection to facilitate land access for next generation farmers. So there are some great organizations, both public and private, in Ohio doing really good work in the land protection and land access spheres. The Department of Agriculture has a pretty successful program where they've helped conserve a lot of agricultural acreage. There are other land trusts across Ohio. So I'm thinking of especially a group like Tecumseh Land Trust. They're working on protecting farmland in perpetuity, and then kind of helping the next generation get onto that land. One of the ways that can work, Ty, if you and I were trying to buy a 180-acre farm, and it were near Columbus or near Cincinnati or Akron or whatever, we're not just competing with other farmers who might be looking to buy that land. You might be competing with a real estate developer, someone who wants to put a subdivision on that land. You might be looking at strip mall developers, whatever it might be. But when we can protect that land through something like a conservation easement, and then restrict its use to purely agricultural use, so if someone can they can buy that land, they can farm the land, they can pass it on to their kids, they can sell it, but forever and always that land is going to be a farm. That will lower the resale value of that land. So the family who protects that land will either get compensated for that with some cash or with tax benefits or whatever that may be. And then the person who buys that, ideally maybe a young new generation farmer, isn't having to compete with that person who wants to put a subdivision on that land. Instead, they're able to buy that at an agriculturally appropriate price, one that makes it a little more possible to actually afford getting into agriculture. So the National Young Farmers Coalition, another great group doing this work across the country, they've done survey after survey of farmers across the nation. And they have found time and again that by and far, the biggest challenge that new generation farmers face is accessing affordable land. So we really see farmland protection as a way that we can help make land more affordable, keep land in agriculture, which has that cascading sorts of environmental, agricultural, economic, social, cultural benefits associated there. So there's really there's reason for hope in this work, despite some of the challenges that we face in places like Ohio.
One of the greatest grassroots story over the past couple of years is when young ag professionals came to Ohio Farm Bureau and said, we are having trouble accessing farmland. And so we put together, along with our General Assembly and Governor DeWine, the New and Beginning Farmer Assistance Program to give tax breaks to younger farmers that want to get into the industry, but also give tax breaks to the older farmers aging out to work with those younger farmers. How do you see younger people finding new and better ways to connect with those older farmers that may not have a family that want to take over and start to build those relationships? And how important is that in this conversation?
It's a great question. I think those relationships are pivotal for increasing not only land access for that new generation, but helping the exiting generation of farmers who have cared for their land for years, sometimes decades, helping them retire or exit the field, literally, with dignity and with confidence and with the ability to step away and have some financial security. So I think if we can really work to connect those two groups, that is really, really important. I think one way that we can do that is through using is not the right word, leveraging relationships that some trusted organizations already have with that older generation of farmers and might start to build with this new generation of farmers. So groups like land trusts, groups like Farm Bureau, folks who have been having these conversations for years, they're trusted advisors, and they can go to these exiting farmers and say, have you thought about an estate plan? Have you thought about succession planning? What's going to happen, in a few years when you need to retire or when someone in the family passes? That is not an easy conversation to have. It is filled with economic elements, with emotional elements. It is really hard to think about transitioning that land. So if you can start that conversation with a trusted partner and a trusted voice who can help you envision a future for that land that goes beyond your own time here on Earth, that can be really, really helpful. And it's a way to start facilitating those relationships, starting those conversations that can yield really productive results.
I mentioned you're one of our very special guests at the Winter Leadership Experience later in January. What are some of the topics you're bringing to Columbus as you visit with our young people here in the Buckeye State?
Yeah, I'll talk about a few things, I think, during my conversation with folks. I'll talk a little bit about my book. Again, Love for the Land, Lessons from Farmers Who Persist in Place. Specifically, these ideas of the power of connecting with and cultivating affection for place, the sense of love being really powerful for motivating good stewardship. But I'll also talk about some of these things that we've already been discussing this morning. I will mention the threats that a lot of Ohio farmland faces from sprawl and low density residential development, other sorts of development. We'll talk about that. I'll share that data. But then I will talk also about how we can leverage farmland protection to really support new generation farmers. I think that's really important. American Farmland Trust is actually, as we speak, launching a couple new projects to really help facilitate that. These are national projects where we actually have some folks on the ground in Ohio who are being trained to help do this sort of work. So I'll be able to talk about that in a little greater detail. I'll be able to talk about some of these land access policy incentives that can really help both the retiring and the entering generations of farmers. I might just talk a little bit about my own farming background. A little different. Tennessee's a little different than Ohio. I grew up on small family farm. We raised tobacco until I was a junior in high school, like a lot of small farmers throughout the South. We've got beef cattle. We're growing our own hay. We got a pretty substantial garden. And so I always look forward to getting to talk farming with other young people who also care about farming. So selfishly, I might just talk about that for a little while during the presentation.
It all sounds great. January 26th and 27th in Columbus, the Young Ag Professionals Winter Leadership Experience, where you can see Brooks Lamb in person. You can find out more and get registered online at experienceyap.com. Brooks, great to see you, and thank you for the conversation. Appreciate it very much.
Thanks, Ty. I appreciate you.
Find out how Nationwide Agribusiness can help you grow your business. Get to know the people with the experience and knowledge to help you. Whether you are looking to protect your farm or ranch from the ground up, or need someone who understands your changing commercial ag needs. Find out how to better manage the risks of your ag business, or how quickly you can get back to business. Learn how you can protect your next with Nationwide on your side.
Since 1919, Ohio Farm Bureau has been working for you, advocating for farm families, for Ohio agriculture, and our local communities. From the State House in Columbus, all the way to Washington, D.C., Ohio Farm Bureau is feeding your need for new ideas. As we look towards the future and the changes coming along with it, one thing will never change: our mission. Working together for Ohio farmers to advance agriculture and strengthen our communities. Learn more and become a member today at ohiofarmbureau.org. Got a lot to cover today at Ohio State's Outlook and Policy Conference, really put on by the Department of agricultural, environmental, and development economics. Dr. Margaret Jodlowski. Didn't think I was going to get through that, did you?
Yeah, it's a long name.
It really is. Then you got to add in the College of Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Sciences on that. Your business card has to be probably that long or so,
It's
right?
really small font.
You covered labor, and you and I have this conversation every year, and every year it gets more and more, I don't want to say complicated, but I'll say interesting as we see challenges. You first took a look with the audience today at the general labor market, and you told people that we're in a period of balance when it comes to where we are now with labor. What does that mean?
Well, what that means is that right after the pandemic, we saw a lot of tension in the labor market. We had a lot of companies looking for people to do work and a lot of people leaving the labor market. You can think about that stretching the difference between labor demanded and labor supplied, so that there was a lot of tension. That tension has now slackened quite a bit, and we see those two things moving back together. We still see jobs being created, which is good, but what we see instead is people returning to the labor market, people being driven back into the labor market, likely due in part to the high inflation we're seeing, those sorts of things providing some sort of headwind, pushing people to find well-paying jobs, to find more jobs, and that has reduced that tension. And so we are now in a sort of balance where we see this about the same number of jobs being created as people looking for jobs. Whereas right after the pandemic, when we had this conversation, it was like 2 jobs for every person looking for a job. Now that number is way back closer to 1, which is what we want.
Another big change since the last couple of years is we saw the Great Resignation, right? Everybody realized they could get a better job and more pay after the pandemic, or maybe even during the pandemic in some cases. Employees now, you say, Dr. Jodlowski, are a bit more loyal. What are the factors causing that shift?
Yes. So one of the things that happened as part of the Great Resignation was it actually ended up being sort of a great reshuffling. It was almost leapfrog behavior. People would move from job to job very quickly. Companies were trying to one-up each other, increasing their wage bill, increasing their benefits, whatever they could do to attract workers. And workers were responding, but they were responding in such a way that was really disruptive and really chaotic. And so there was a lot of this shuffling behavior. And what we see now is that the wage growth for people who switch jobs has fallen really dramatically. So that behavior is no longer being rewarded. And as a consequence, we are seeing that behavior it's still happening to some extent, and it always will happen. People are always going to look for what's best for them. But that overall, market trend in sort of job shuffling has gone way, way down and has almost completely moderated out of the labor market and has returned to its sort of pre-pandemic levels.
So that covers the general labor market. Let's break it down to agriculture.
Yes.
And one thing I was curious about, you broke down numbers in other sectors of development in your talk. And I don't think we talk enough about the other industries that are competing with agriculture for a labor force. What are those other industries, and how does that competition look right now?
So you can think about the traditional industries that compete for agricultural workers. Traditionally, the number one area we see was construction, and then maybe a little bit transportation. We talk about construction more because the skill set that goes into agricultural work, it's hard work, long hours, tends to be more physical labor. Those skill sets apply pretty much equally across, different kinds of construction and agricultural jobs. So construction has always been sort of the bellwether for what economic drivers are going to push workers out of the agricultural labor market and maybe into construction. And so what we were maybe hoping to see is that the increase in the interest rate would drive down housing demand, which would drive down construction wages. That really hasn't happened to the extent that we might have expected it would. Demand for housing, even with the high interest rates, has remained really stable. I'm not going to say that it's still increasing, but it's definitely still there. And that has kept the construction wage pretty high, which, if you're a construction worker or in a construction industry is a great news. But if you're an agricultural employer, those are the workers that you're competing with for jobs. And if their wage increases are going up, 20%, that's going to be really hard to compete with from an agricultural perspective.
We've talked a lot about labor at Ohio Farm Bureau, have a resource for our members, in fact, to better find, attract, and keep those employees. We also talked, as we had this conversation in our organization, about H-2A and the use of H-2A in Ohio. Where are we seeing that now, and where do you see that going?
Right now, it's on it looks like a vertical line almost when I present it. It's dramatic increases year over year. It slackened off quite a bit in 2020 due to all the disruptions, but it picked that trend up, and it, I thought maybe in this 2023, once that 2023 data came out, it would show some signs of slackening off again, just because it felt like the growth was almost unsustainable in the last year, and it really hasn't. It is still on this sort of breakneck pace. The numbers still aren't crazy. We're nowhere near approaching California numbers. Obviously, are by far the highest, but Michigan's are also quite high. They're a neighboring state. We're not nearly at those levels. They still have about twice the number of H-2A workers, maybe even 3 times the number of H-2A workers that we have. The numbers are going up quite dramatically, and now we're in a period where the number of H-2A workers is actually more than the number of non-H-2A workers in agriculture, which is, it will have big differences by sector, because, there are livestock operations that can't use H-2A. So,
also, it has a huge impact on wages, right?
Yes.
H-2A has a minimum wage that farmers have to abide by, and that
yes.
pushes the minimum wage for other workers on the farm a little bit higher as well.
It does, and so the AWAR, the adverse effect wage rate, which is the wage you mandated to pay to an H-2A worker, has gone up as well, and that is getting a lot of attention. The construction of the AWAR, the factors that go into it, and it doesn't seem to be coming back down, and it's quite a challenge. And I mean, if I don't expect it to come back down. It's now at $17.17 in Ohio, which is, quite a bit more than I think. I mean, certainly more than the minimum wage for sure, but is quite a bit more than I think small and medium-sized operations can afford. So,
be remiss if I worked for Farm Bureau didn't ask you about policy. Where do you see policy heading on the ag labor front?
So right now it seems all of the current policy, proposals that we had a bill that seemed to have some legs when we were talking last year. That is the Agricultural Workforce Modernization Act. I really don't see it. At this point, I would say effectively it's dead in the water, and that is due to a few contributing factors. I think as we move into the Farm Bill season or the Farm Bill cycle, that's getting a lot more attention. Labor doesn't traditionally factor into the Farm Bill, so it's less popular. It's also less politically popular because it will require bipartisan support. And both parties have acknowledged that this is a huge problem, but as we get closer to an election cycle, it's harder to make these bipartisan efforts move forward in any sort of meaningful way, even though I think everyone acknowledges that it's super necessary. What we're seeing instead is more proposed rulemaking from DOL, just more on, I wouldn't say necessarily lower level stuff, but none of the broad changes that we need to ensure a responsive and available workforce for agriculture, either in Ohio or nationwide.
Labor, one of the biggest challenges in agriculture, it seems year in and year out, always makes this conversation more and more interesting with Dr. Margaret Jodlowski with The Ohio State University. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.